She never planned to start over at 37, but sometimes life doesn't ask for permission. It just breaks you open and waits to see what you'll do next. Claire Donovan thought she had it all figured out. A stable marriage, a predictable career, a map for her future, until the night everything she built quietly fell apart. So, she drove west, chasing the sound of the ocean, searching for something she couldn't name, and then she met him. A stranger with steady eyes and words that cut through the noise inside her. A man who seemed to understand freedom and loss in the same breath. One unforgettable night by the Pacific, and then he was gone. Until fate placed him exactly where she least expected, behind the desk, holding the power she could no longer ignore, her new boss. But this isn't a story about scandal. It's a story about awakening, about the rules we live by, and the ones we're brave enough to rewrite. Because sometimes, the person who challenges your heart the most is the one who shows you who you really are. Stay with this story. You might find a part of your own heart inside it. The wind carried the scent of salt and the promise of autumn. From the balcony of the Lighthouse Grill, Claire Donovan watched the Pacific stretch endlessly, a sheet of dark silk rippling beneath the silver moon. The air was cool, and the waves rolled with a rhythm that felt both ancient and familiar, like the quiet pulse of a world that had seen too much, yet never forgot how to breathe. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It had been 3 weeks since she'd signed the final papers, closing the door on 10 years of marriage, 10 years of laughter and silence, of shared calendars and lonely dinners. Now, at 37, she found herself sitting in a small seaside town called Carmel by the Sea, hoping the ocean could do what therapy and reason had not helped her feel whole again. There was a glass of Chardonnay beside her, half finished. She didn't really like wine, but she liked the way it caught the light soft gold against the navy of the night. Around her, the restaurant hummed quietly with conversation, couples leaning close, friends laughing, someone playing a slow tune on a guitar inside. Claire sat apart, as if watching a movie where everyone else knew their lines, but she had forgotten hers. She wasn't lonely exactly, just suspended between who she had been and whoever she might become next. A man's voice broke through her thoughts, low and warm. "Mind if I sit here? The bar inside is full." She turned. He was tall, maybe early 40s, with salt and pepper hair that caught the lamplight and eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and something unreadable. He wore a simple gray sweater, jeans, and an expression that managed to be both curious and calm. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "It's a free country," she said with a faint smile. He sat, leaving a respectful space between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The ocean did the talking, whispering in the distance. Then he said, "You don't look like a tourist." She raised an eyebrow. "What gives me away? You're not trying to take a picture of the sunset. That's usually the first sign." She laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in weeks. It felt strange, a little rusty, but good. Maybe I've already seen enough sunsets. He looked at her then, really looked, and said quietly, "Or maybe you're just waiting for a new one." His words landed somewhere deep inside her, in that unlit place where she stored all the things she didn't say aloud. She studied him, sensing a familiarity that made no sense. There was something in his presence steady, unhurried, that felt like a mirror. They talked about the ocean, about how the world seemed to rush faster every year, about freedom and how easily it could slip through your fingers when you weren't paying attention. Claire found herself saying things she hadn't meant to share, how she'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a house with no windows. How she'd forgotten the sound of her own laughter until just now. He listened without interrupting, and when he spoke, his voice had that kind of weight people earn from heartbreak. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you have to lose everything to see what's truly yours." She turned toward him, surprised. "That sounds like experience talking." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I've had a front row seat to loss." They fell silent, The kind of silence that isn't awkward but full like two souls recognizing each other's wounds. The tide came closer, the air colder. Somewhere down the beach, a dog barked, and laughter echoed faintly before fading into the night. When he suggested a walk, she agreed. The sand was cool beneath their shoes, the moon high enough to draw a silver path on the water. They walked without touching, speaking in fragments about music, about cities they had loved, about how time changes not just the body, but the heart. With every step, the distance between them felt smaller, though neither moved closer. At some point, she realized she didn't even know his name. "I'm Claire," she said, the words catching slightly on the wind. He looked at her as if memorizing the sound of it. Ethan, just that, no last name, no titles, two strangers on the edge of the world, meeting where the sea met the shore. They stopped where the waves brushed their feet. He turned to her, eyes reflecting the moonlight. For a long moment, the world seemed to pause, the ocean, the breeze, even her own heartbeat. Then, without a word, he leaned in. It wasn't a kiss born of impulse, but of recognition, gentle, hesitant, as if they both knew they'd been searching for this without realizing it. When it ended, neither spoke. The night went on, breathing around them, vast and forgiving. Back at the restaurant, they said goodbye like people who understood the beauty of things that aren't meant to be rushed. No phone numbers, no promises, just a look that said, maybe someday. As Claire watched him walk away, a quiet calm settled over her. For the first time in months, the ache inside her felt softer, like the tide pulling gently instead of crashing. She didn't know who he was or why their paths had crossed, but she knew this something inside her had shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a curtain opening to let the morning light in. She lifted her glass to the sea, took the last sip, and smiled. Maybe healing didn't always come from knowing what would happen next. Maybe it began the moment you allowed yourself to be seen. And that night, beneath the Pacific moon, Claire Donovan began to find her way home to herself. The next morning, the sea looked different, calmer, as if it, too, had exhaled during the night. Claire woke with the taste of salt still on her lips and a warmth she couldn't name in her chest. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss, it was the memory of being seen. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her as if she wasn't a woman broken by divorce or weighed down by what she had lost, but simply alive. She spent the morning walking through Carmel's narrow streets, where bougainvillea spilled over white fences and shop windows glowed with early light. Everything felt sharper, more vivid. Maybe that was what healing looked like, not a sudden burst of joy, but a slow return of color. By the time she found herself back at the Lighthouse Grill that evening, she didn't know what she was expecting. Maybe to see him again, maybe not. Life had a way of giving you moments that weren't meant to last, and she had learned to let them pass gently. Still, when she heard his voice behind her, steady, familiar, her heart gave a quiet, disobedient leap. "Didn't think I'd find you in the same spot," Ethan said. She smiled, keeping her eyes on the horizon. "Maybe I was hoping the ocean would bring something back." He sat down beside her, leaving that same careful distance between them. For a while, they just listened to the surf. The moon was rising, soft and round, its reflection trembling on the water like a secret trying to be told. He spoke first. "You know," he said, "I used to think happiness was something you built like a house, brick by brick. You get the job, the partner, the plans, and if you work hard enough, it stays standing." Claire turned to look at him. "And now I think," he said slowly, "it's more like the tide. It comes and goes. Sometimes it leaves you standing in the sand, wondering what you did wrong. But it always returns, if you're patient enough to wait." She studied his face in the moonlight. He had the look of a man who had waited too long for something he couldn't name. "I thought I knew what happiness was," she admitted. "A house in Seattle, a marriage that looked fine from the outside, dinners where we talked about work but never about us. And then one day, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt home." Her voice caught, and she looked away. The waves answered for her, rolling against the rocks with a gentle insistence. Ethan's tone softened. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to lose everything to see what's truly yours." The words hung between them simple, but, with the weight of truth, Claire felt them sink into her, slow and steady, like rain seeping into dry earth. For a moment, she couldn't speak. "Do you really believe that?" she whispered. He nodded. "It's the only thing that ever made sense." They walked then, side by side along the beach. The sand was cool beneath their shoes, the moon tracing a path of silver ahead of them. Neither said much, and yet it felt like a conversation, their silence speaking of years they couldn't undo, and of the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to begin again. Claire found herself laughing when he told her about the time he tried to learn surfing and nearly lost his board to a curious seal. Ethan laughed too, a low, rich sound that wrapped around her like a blanket. For a man who carried so much gravity in his eyes, his laughter was unexpectedly gentle. At one point, she tripped on a piece of driftwood, and he reached out instinctively, his hand steadying her by the elbow. The touch was brief, but it felt electric, like touching something sacred, something you weren't sure you deserved. Their steps slowed. The night air was cooler now, and she could see her breath when she spoke. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "if we're meant to cross paths with certain people only once, just long enough to remember what we're missing?" Ethan looked at her for a long time before answering. "Maybe. Or maybe some people are reminders showing up when you've forgotten who you are." She wanted to ask him what she was supposed to be reminded of, but the question stayed on her tongue. The truth was, she already knew. He reminded her of something she hadn't felt since her 20s, the thrill of possibility. They stopped near the waterline, where the waves reached just far enough to brush against their shoes. The sound of the ocean filled the space between heartbeats. Claire looked up at him. "We don't even know each other," she said softly, almost apologetically. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried a trace of sorrow. "Maybe that's why it's so easy." The world seemed to hold its breath. She could hear the surf, the whisper of wind through the dunes, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of her own heartbeat. Then he stepped closer. The kiss was inevitable, as natural as the tide returning to shore. There was no urgency, no hunger, only a quiet recognition. It was the kind of kiss that said, "I see you, I understand." When it ended, Claire felt both lighter and unmoored, like a leaf caught in a current she didn't want to escape. They walked back slowly, saying little. When they reached the restaurant, Ethan turned to her. "Maybe it's better if we leave it here," he said, his voice low. She nodded, though every part of her wanted to ask why. "Maybe," she said. Neither offered a name nor a number. There was no exchange of promises, no farewell that tried to define what had just happened. They simply stood there, letting the silence do what words could not. He looked at her once more, and for a fleeting second, she thought he might say something, anything to make the moment stay. But he only smiled, the kind of smile that breaks and heals at the same time, and walked away into the fog that had begun to drift in from the sea. Claire watched until he disappeared. Then she turned back toward the water, the night air cool against her skin. The ocean whispered softly, as if keeping her secret. She didn't know his last name, or where he came from, but she knew this. Some meetings are not accidents. Some people arrive in your life not to stay, but to remind you that your heart is still capable of opening. As the tide crept higher and the moon climbed further into the sky, Claire closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. Maybe happiness wasn't something you found or built. Maybe it was something that found you when you were finally still enough to feel it. For 3 days, the sea had been her companion. Claire stayed in Carmel a little longer than planned, walking the same stretch of sand where she'd met him. She didn't know why she kept going back, maybe to prove to herself that she could stand in the same place and feel something different. But each time, when the tide came in and the horizon blurred with mist, she found herself remembering the sound of his voice, the warmth of his hand, the way the night had felt both infinite and fleeting. And then, on the morning of the third day, She told herself it was time to go. Life, she thought, has a way of giving you a beautiful detour before returning you to the road you're meant to walk. That night in Carmel was her detour. The rest, her future waited in Seattle. The airport was busy, the kind of organized chaos that made her feel anonymous again. She liked that. She boarded her flight with a quiet sense of purpose. A new job, a new city, a new version of herself that was the plan. She would leave the ocean behind and carry only what it had taught her, that endings could also be beginnings, if you let them. Seattle greeted her with drizzle, the kind that misted instead of falling, turning the streets into mirrors of gray and light. From the taxi window, the city felt alive, towering buildings framed by evergreens, a skyline softened by fog. It wasn't the quiet poetry of Carmel, but there was something comforting in its steadiness. Here, she could rebuild. Claire's new position at Northern Peaks Group, one of the most respected hospitality companies in the Pacific Northwest, was a significant step forward. The company prided itself on precision, luxury, and efficiency. Three things her old life had lacked. She'd been hired as a senior operations manager for their upcoming project, Evergreen Resort, a mountain property designed to blend comfort with nature. On her first day, she wore a charcoal gray suit and a quiet smile, the kind that said she was ready. Her colleagues greeted her politely, each introduction a blend of practiced warmth and corporate formality. There was Martha Keller, head of human resources, a woman in her mid-50s with eyes that seemed to notice everything. "You'll fit right in here," she said kindly. "Everyone's a bit obsessed with perfection, but you learn to love it." Then there was Lucas Hayes, the finance consultant, a little too charming, with the kind of confidence that belonged to people who'd never been truly hurt. He shook Claire's hand and said, "Seattle's lucky tonight. It just got sunnier." She laughed politely, not unkindly, but there was a line she didn't want anyone to cross, not yet. As the day went on, Claire found comfort in structure, meetings, spreadsheets, schedules, things she could control. The hum of productivity was its own kind of therapy. She liked the sound of people typing, the smell of coffee that drifted through the corridors, the quiet determination that filled the building. For the first time since her marriage ended, she felt useful again. By the afternoon, an email arrived: mandatory company assembly, executive introduction, 4:00 p.m., main conference hall. She didn't think much of it. Companies like this always like to make grand gestures when introducing new leadership. It was probably another suit from the East Coast, someone with a perfect resume and a corporate smile. When she entered the hall, the room was already buzzing. Rows of chairs, the faint hum of conversation, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and polished wood. Claire found a seat near the middle, between two marketing directors she'd just met. The lights dimmed slightly, and Martha took the stage first. Her voice was firm but warm. "As you all know, Northern Peaks is entering an exciting new era, and we're privileged to be guided by someone whose vision and integrity have already transformed the hospitality world." Claire listened, only half focused, jotting a few notes in her leather-bound planner. She didn't even look up when Martha said, "Please welcome our new Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Ethan Cole." The pen froze in her hand. At first, she thought she'd imagined it. The name echoed inside her head, absurdly, impossibly. She forced herself to look up. He was standing there on the stage, under the cool glow of the lights, wearing a tailored navy suit and that same calm, deliberate expression she remembered from the shore. His eyes scanned the audience with quiet confidence, and when they landed just for a second on her, she knew he recognized her too. Her heart thudded once, hard enough to steal her breath. Ethan's voice was steady as he began to speak. "I believe a company is only as strong as the people who carry its purpose. We're not just in the business of hotels, we're in the business of moments, the kind that stay with people long after they've left." He paused, and his gaze drifted across the crowd again. This time, it lingered briefly, almost imperceptibly on Claire. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The air felt heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The memories from Carmel came rushing back: the wine, the laughter, the kiss, the way he'd said, "Maybe it's better if we leave it here." She had believed that night belonged to the sea, to the stars, to something untouchable. But now, that same man stood before her, not as a stranger from the shore, but as her CEO. Fate, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Applause, introductions, polite laughter. She went through the motions like someone watching herself from a distance. When it was over, people rose from their chairs, murmuring about leadership strategies and market projections. Claire remained seated, staring at the stage long after Ethan had stepped down. Somewhere inside her, something trembled, a mix of disbelief and a strange, uninvited hope. That night, as she rode the elevator to her apartment on the 12th floor, the city lights spread beneath her like constellations. She thought of the Pacific again, the endless water, the way it could bring people together and pull them apart just as easily. Maybe this was life's way of testing her resolve. Maybe she was meant to face what she had left unfinished. When she closed her eyes, she saw his face again. Not the CEO now, but the man who had stood barefoot on the beach, speaking softly about loss and love and the fragile courage it took to start over. Claire didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but as the elevator doors opened, she took a slow breath and whispered to herself, "You came here to begin again, so begin." And outside, through the drizzle and city glow, Seattle waited steady, gray, and full of untold stories. For the next few days, Claire moved through the office like a ghost in her own life, present, composed, but not entirely there. The image of Ethan Cole standing on that stage still hovered in her mind, stubborn as a shadow she couldn't step out of. She'd told herself she was ready to begin again, ready to put the past behind her. But the universe, it seemed, had a different sense of humor. Every morning, she passed the framed photographs in the hallway, mountain lodges under fresh snow, the shimmer of glassy lakes reflecting golden light, symbols of a company built on stability and grace. And yet, inside her, everything felt unsteady. When she finally saw him again, it wasn't under moonlight or ocean breeze. It was in the polished conference room on the 14th floor, under fluorescent lights that left no room for mystery. Ethan was standing near the window, speaking with two board members. The Seattle skyline stretched behind him, gray clouds, steel, and rain. He looked different here, sharper somehow, his warmth replaced by the kind of authority that filled a room before he even spoke. "Good morning, everyone," he said when she entered, his tone smooth and practiced. Their eyes met for half a heartbeat. No flicker of recognition, no pause, nothing. Claire Donovan, Martha introduced, smiling. "Our new operations manager. She'll be leading the Evergreen Resort project." Ethan nodded once. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Donovan. I've heard good things." The words were polite, professional, but to Claire, they landed like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't just pretend not to know her. He was perfect at it. She forced a calm smile. "Thank you. Mr. Cole, I'm glad to be here." The meeting went on. They discussed budgets, staffing, logistics, ordinary details spoken in careful, efficient tones. But beneath the surface, every syllable felt like a test of endurance. Claire could hear her pulse in her ears, feel the tremor in her hands she hid beneath the table. When it ended, she lingered for a moment, collecting her notes. Ethan glanced her way once, then turned to speak with someone else, his expression unreadable. Outside the glass door, Martha fell into step beside her. "You'll like working under him," she said. "He's demanding, but fair. Just don't expect small talk." Claire smiled faintly. Noted. That night, she stayed late in her office. The rain had returned, soft against the windows, and the city glowed faintly through the mist. She opened the company handbook for the first time, mostly out of habit, trying to distract herself from the chaos of her thoughts. Halfway through the policies, one headline caught her eye: Zero Relationship Policy, Section 4B. Her heart stilled. It was a strict rule: no personal or romantic relationships between employees, regardless of rank. Violation could lead to termination. The words were cold, precise, and absolute. But what froze her wasn't the policy itself. It was the name at the bottom of the document, authored and approved by Ethan Cole, CEO. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. Of course. He hadn't just agreed with the rule, he had built it. And now she understood the look in his eyes earlier, not indifference, but control. He wasn't pretending for convenience. He was protecting himself. Protecting both of them from something that couldn't exist inside those glass walls. Still, the realization stung. What then? Had that night been a moment of weakness, a beautiful accident meant to be buried beneath policy and professionalism? Her thoughts tangled like the rain streaking down the window. From his office across the hall, Ethan stood alone. The lights were low, his tie loosened, a single hand resting against the glass as he looked out at the city below. He could see her reflection in the distance, head bowed, the glow of her computer outlining her silhouette. He'd told himself he could handle this, that he could separate what had happened from what must happen. But seeing her again here, within reach and yet impossibly out of bounds, had cracked something inside him. He remembered the softness of her voice, the taste of sea salt on the air, the way she'd looked at him like he was more than the sum of his mistakes. He'd made that policy to protect the company. At least, that was the official story. The truth was harder to admit. He'd written it to protect his own heart. Ethan had seen what love could do in an office, how it blurred lines, how it turned strength into vulnerability. Years ago, it had cost him nearly everything. He wouldn't risk that again. And yet, here she was. The next morning, Claire entered the elevator just as the doors were closing, and there he was, alone inside. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the elevator filled the silence. "Morning," she said finally. "Morning," he replied, his tone even. The floor numbers lit up one by one. She turned to him, meeting his eyes. "You didn't have to pretend. You know." He looked at her, a trace of something flickering behind his calm. "It's better this way." For whom, she asked softly. He didn't answer. The elevator chimed, the doors opened. As she stepped out, his voice followed, quiet and firm. "About that night, we both need to forget it." Claire paused, her back to him. Then she turned slightly, just enough for him to see the defiance in her eyes. "Can you?" He said nothing. The doors slid shut between them. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but somewhere beyond the clouds, a thin light was breaking through. Claire walked toward her office, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Her heart was a storm of questions, but beneath it all, one truth began to rise, a quiet, unsettling certainty that the story between them wasn't over. Maybe the rules could silence a memory, but they couldn't erase the echo of what it had meant. And as she reached her desk, she whispered to herself, not in bitterness, but in wonder. Sometimes, the hardest walls to break are the ones we build to protect ourselves. For the next few days, Claire and Ethan moved through the same hallways as if the other didn't exist. Their offices were only 50 feet apart, yet the silence between them felt like an entire ocean. They passed each other during meetings, in elevators, even once at the coffee machine, each exchange marked by a polite nod, a faint acknowledgement, and then distance. It was as though they had signed a silent treaty. We will not look back. And yet, the memory of that night clung to the edges of their thoughts like salt on skin. Claire found herself remembering his voice in quiet moments, the way he had said, "Sometimes, you have to lose everything to see what's truly yours." It had sounded philosophical then, but now, in the fluorescent reality of the office, it felt almost cruel. On Thursday morning, her phone buzzed with a calendar invitation. Meeting Evergreen Resort, strategic review, location executive office, host Ethan Cole. Her heart gave a small, involuntary jolt. It wasn't unusual for the CEO to meet with department leads, but this was the first time he had called her in alone. by 2 She stood outside his office door, smoothing the sleeve of her navy blazer. Through the glass, she could see him head bent slightly, reviewing a document. His posture was disciplined, controlled, but his expression carried that same quiet gravity she remembered from the beach. She took a breath and knocked lightly. "Come in," he said without looking up. The room was all clean lines and quiet authority. Large windows framed a view of downtown Seattle, rain tracing faint lines down the glass. A single framed photograph of a mountain range hung behind his desk, snow-capped peaks under a wide sky. "Ms. Donovan," he greeted formally. "Please, have a seat." "Thank you," she said, matching his tone. Her voice sounded calm, though her pulse betrayed her. He gestured toward a folder. "The Evergreen project is behind schedule. I want to know why." Claire opened her notes, relieved to have something tangible to hold on to. "There were some delays with the vendor contracts," she explained. "Supply issues out of Denver. We're renegotiating for faster shipment." Ethan nodded, his gaze focused on the documents, but not entirely on them. "And the design phase on track," she said. "The architecture team is working closely with operations. We should have final approvals by next month." He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. "Good. I don't want this project becoming another case study in over-promising and under-delivering." She smiled faintly. "I don't plan to let that happen." For a moment. Their eyes met briefly, unintentionally, and the air shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. The room seemed smaller, the silence heavier. Ethan cleared his throat and looked away. Flipping a page, "You're thorough," he said quietly. "I appreciate that." "Thank you," she replied, but her voice carried a softness she hadn't meant to reveal. He closed the folder. "That's all for now." She gathered her things, standing, but something in his tone too careful, too measured made her pause. She looked at him. He wasn't writing, wasn't pretending to be busy anymore. His jaw tightened, his hand resting loosely on the desk as if holding himself in place. When she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her. "Claire." It was the first time he'd said her name since Carmel. The sound of it in his voice pulled at something deep inside her. She turned. "Yes." He hesitated, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. About that night, his tone lowered, almost to a whisper. "We both need to forget it." For a moment, she said nothing. The rain tapped softly against the glass, the city humming faintly below them. Then she met his eyes steady, clear, unflinching. "Can you?" The question hung there, delicate and dangerous. Ethan's gaze flickered, just slightly, before he looked away. "That's not the point," he said quietly. "No," she replied, her voice calm but sure. "That's exactly the point." He didn't answer. The silence stretched again, filling the room with a tension neither of them could break. She could feel the electricity in it, something raw and human, pressed beneath layers of professionalism and restraint. Finally, she turned the handle and opened the door. The cool hallway air met her face like a release. But before she stepped out, she looked back once more. Ethan stood where she'd left him, framed by the window, his silhouette outlined against the gray Seattle sky. In that moment, she realized something simple, yet undeniable. He wasn't untouched by it. He was fighting the same storm, just quieter. Back at her desk, Claire tried to bury herself in work. She opened spreadsheets, answered emails, typed notes she barely read. But her focus fractured with every thought of him. There was a fine cruelty in proximity, the way the heart remembered what the mind tried to erase. Every meeting, every accidental glance in the hallway, every polite exchange about budgets and deadlines only deepened the ache of what they weren't allowed to acknowledge. Late that evening, as most of the office lights dimmed, she stood by her window, watching the rain. Below, the streets shimmered in reflections of red and gold. In another office across the building, Ethan stood in the same position, looking out at the same city, unaware or perhaps too aware that their thoughts were tracing the same path. For both of them, forgetting wasn't the problem. It was pretending that they could. And somewhere between duty and desire, between memory and reason, something began to take shape, not a plan, not yet a confession, but the quiet pull of two souls who had met once by accident and now, against every rule, were being drawn together again. The night stretched on, full of questions neither dared to ask. But beneath the silence, the truth was already speaking. Some connections, no matter how forbidden, refuse to disappear. They wait patient, steady as if time itself is holding its breath. And deep down, both Claire and Ethan knew the story that had begun by the Pacific was far from over. For days after that meeting, Claire tried to shake off the echo of his words. We both need to forget it. But words like that don't simply fade. They linger in the quiet moments over morning coffee, in the hum of an elevator, or in the pause before sleep when the mind is too tired to pretend. She told herself to move on, to let logic win over longing. Yet every time she saw him in the hallway, or heard his voice during a meeting, the ache in her chest reminded her that some parts of the heart are immune to reason. By the end of that week, exhaustion had settled into her bones, the kind that didn't come from work, but from holding too much inside. So, when Martha Keller, the head of HR, stopped by her office with a gentle knock and said, "How about a late lunch? You look like you could use one," Claire didn't argue. They went to a quiet cafe a few blocks from the office, a place with warm lighting and old jazz drifting softly from hidden speakers. Martha ordered chamomile tea. Claire chose black coffee, though she barely touched it. For a while, they spoke about work budgets, deadlines, the usual rhythm of corporate life. But Martha had a way of looking at people that seemed to read between their sentences. Finally, she leaned back, stirring her tea slowly. "You've adjusted well," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But I can tell when someone's carrying more than spreadsheets." Claire hesitated, unsure how much to say. "I suppose I'm still finding my footing," she said quietly. Martha nodded, her eyes kind but knowing. "Finding your footing?" she repeated softly. "That's what most of us spend our whole lives doing." There was a pause, and then, almost as if she'd been waiting for the right moment, Martha said, "You've heard about the zero relationship policy. I assume—" "Yes," Claire replied. "It's impossible to miss." "Do you know where it came from?" Claire shook her head. "I assumed it was a legal precaution, a way to keep the company's image clean." Martha smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing too much. That's the official line, but it's not the whole story. She looked out the window for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to share. Then she began. 7 years ago, she said, Ethan Cole wasn't the man you see today. He was brilliant, yes, but reckless with his heart. Back then, he worked for a smaller hospitality firm, family-owned, close-knit. He fell in love with a colleague. She was bright, ambitious, much like you. Claire's pulse quickened, though she stayed still. Their relationship was intense. Martha continued, passionate, maybe even beautiful at first. But when personal emotions mix with professional ambition, things get complicated. Lines blur. People start taking sides. And when it ended, she exhaled slowly. It didn't just end the relationship. It broke the company apart. Claire listened in silence. Outside, a fine drizzle painted the windows. "The board lost faith," Martha said softly. "Rumors spread. Staff quit. By the time the dust settled, the company he'd helped build was gone. He blamed himself for it, for loving someone he shouldn't have, for letting emotion outrun judgment." She set her cup down gently, her voice lowering. "When he started Northern Peaks, he made that policy himself. Not because he didn't believe in love, but because he didn't trust it anymore. Not in the workplace. Not around him." Claire felt something shift inside her, something fragile and tender. She had expected to feel anger at his coldness, his distance. Instead, what rose in her chest was understanding. "He built this wall," Martha said, her gaze softening, not to protect the company, but to protect himself. For a while, neither of them spoke. The clinking of cups and the hum of conversation filled the quiet between them. Claire stared down at her untouched coffee, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger. "Did you know her?" she asked. "I did," Martha said simply. She was kind, and she loved him deeply. But timing, she gave a small, sad shrug. Timing can be cruel. As they walked back to the office later, Claire felt the city's gray afternoon light settle gently over her. She thought about Ethan, about the quiet restraint in his voice, the way he looked at her and looked away in the same breath. For the first time, she saw not just the man who had rejected her, but the man who was still trying to forgive himself. In the days that followed, that knowledge changed the way she looked at him. It didn't make their situation easier, but it made it human. She noticed small things she hadn't before, the way he paused before speaking in meetings, as if weighing the cost of every word, the way he carried exhaustion behind his confidence, like a man who never fully allowed himself to rest. And sometimes, when he passed her in the corridor and their eyes met for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a flicker of that same quiet sorrow reflected back two people carrying different versions of the same story. That night, as she stood by her window watching the rain thread down the glass, she whispered into the silence, almost to herself. He built a wall because once he didn't have one, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger at the distance between them. She felt compassion deep, unexpected, and warm. Because some walls, she realized, aren't made of pride. They're made of pain. And sometimes, love isn't about breaking those walls down, but waiting patiently until the person behind them is ready to open the door. After her lunch with Martha, Claire couldn't look at Ethan the same way again. The knowledge of his past, of the heartbreak that had driven him to build a fortress of rules, softened something inside her. It didn't erase the confusion or the ache she still carried, but it made it gentler, quieter, more understanding. She began to notice the human beneath the title, the small, almost imperceptible signs of a man who carried too much the way he paused a second too long before replying, how he rubbed the bridge of his nose when no one was watching, the rare moments when his laughter slipped through in meetings, quick and unguarded before he caught himself again. The Evergreen Resort project demanded constant collaboration between departments. That meant meetings, presentations, strategy calls, and Claire and Ethan found themselves side by side more often than either of them expected. On paper, they were perfect complements, her attention to detail balancing his wide-lens vision, her empathy grounding his discipline. Colleagues noticed their chemistry, though no one said it aloud. It was there in the easy rhythm of their exchanges, in the way their ideas seemed to intertwine naturally, like two instruments finding the same melody. And yet, beneath that surface harmony, tension lingered, an invisible line drawn by circumstance, by policy, by fear. Ethan kept his tone professional, his distance deliberate. But sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze softened just for a second. Before the mask returned, Claire saw it every time. The loneliness in his eyes wasn't loud. It lived quietly, tucked behind restraint and leadership. And perhaps because she knew what loneliness felt like, she recognized it in him. One Friday evening, the office was almost empty. The rain outside came steady and soft, blurring the city lights into watercolor smudges across the tall glass windows. Claire was still at her desk, finalizing logistics for a site inspection. The sound of her keyboard was the only thing breaking the hush. A knock on the door startled her. Ethan stood there, holding a folder. His tie was loosened, his expression unreadable. "Still here?" he asked. She smiled faintly, just trying to stay ahead of next week's deadlines. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The board's expecting progress updates on Evergreen. "I thought we could go over the financials together." "Of course," she said, gesturing to the conference table near the window. They worked quietly for a while. The only sounds were the low hum of the building, the soft patter of rain, and the rustle of paper. Claire could feel his presence beside her, steady, composed, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet restlessness, like a man trying to hold still when every part of him wanted to move. At one point, their hands brushed as they reached for the same document. Both froze, Neither moved for a moment too long. Then Ethan withdrew his hand, his voice low but even. "Sorry. It's fine," she said softly. But her heart was no longer fine. He glanced toward the window, as if the view could save him. "It's been raining all week," he murmured. "Seattle's good at that," she replied. "It rains even when it doesn't need to." He gave a small smile, one that almost looked like surrender. "Some things you can't control. Some things you shouldn't," she said before she could stop herself. The words lingered between them, heavier than they should have been. He looked at her, then really looked, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. It was the same look she remembered from the beach searching, unsure, yet full of something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. She tried to break the silence. "Ethan, about the policy," he interrupted gently. "Claire, don't." But she pressed on, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "You built that rule to protect yourself, didn't you? Not just the company." He didn't deny it. His silence was its own confession. "People heal," she whispered. "Even from the things that once broke them?" Ethan's eyes met hers, and in that instant, the carefully drawn line between them blurred. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough for her to feel the shift in the air, the hum of something unspoken. "Don't make this harder," he said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not," she said. "I'm just not pretending anymore." For a moment, neither moved. The rain outside thickened, a steady rhythm against the glass. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the seconds of their hesitation. Then, as if pulled by gravity, he reached out, his hand brushed against hers barely, gently, just the ghost of a touch. The contact was electric, fragile, and full of everything they weren't saying. She didn't pull away. His fingers lingered, trembling slightly, before he finally drew back, as though the effort of restraint cost him something physical. His jaw tightened, his eyes closed briefly. A silent battle waged and lost behind them. "Good night." "Claire," he said, his voice rougher now. She nodded, unable to trust her own voice. "Good night." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps measured, his shoulders squared in that familiar armor of control. But just before he left, he paused, hand on the door, back still to her. Without turning, he said softly, "You deserve someone who isn't afraid to stay." And then he was gone. The door closed, and the office felt impossibly still. Claire stood where he had left her, the faint warmth of his touch still burning on her skin, the sound of the rain filling the empty space he'd left behind. She sat down slowly, staring at the city through the glass. The skyline shimmered under the drizzle, lights flickering like distant stars, steady, yet untouchable. She thought about all the ways people try to protect themselves from pain rules, distance, silence, and how those same defenses can sometimes become the very walls that keep love out. Somewhere deep down, she knew this was not the end of their story. The pull between them wasn't something either of them could file away in a report or silence with reason. It was patient, persistent, waiting. As the rain eased into mist, Claire whispered to the empty room, "Maybe someday, you'll let yourself stay." Outside, the night gave no answer, but in the soft rhythm of raindrops against the glass, there was a quiet promise, the kind that lives in the space between what is said and what is felt. The following week unfolded with a fragile calm, like the quiet that follows a storm no one dares to mention. After that night in the office, Claire and Ethan seemed to move around each other more carefully, each aware of the invisible thread still pulling between them, yet determined not to tug too hard. They spoke only when necessary, and when they did, their words were polite, measured, stripped of anything that might betray feeling, but under the polished surface of professionalism, something unspoken trembled. Claire buried herself in work. The Evergreen Resort project was gaining momentum, and deadlines loomed like gray clouds over the horizon. Long hours became her refuge. Focus was easier than feeling. Still, there were moments fleeting, unpredictable, when her eyes wandered toward the glass office across the hall. catching a glimpse of him. Sometimes, he was standing by the window, arms folded, gaze distant. Other times, he was bent over paperwork, the lamplight tracing the sharp lines of his profile, always composed, always untouchable. It was during this quiet tension that Lucas Hayes appeared. He was 38, a financial consultant brought in to streamline budget efficiency across multiple projects. The kind of man who carried an easy charm wherever he went, handsome in a polished way, confident without arrogance. He greeted people by name, remembered details, and laughed easily. In a company of guarded professionals, Lucas felt like sunlight breaking through a stretch of gray Seattle sky. Claire met him on a Tuesday morning when he stopped by her office to review cost projections. "You must be Claire Donovan," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "The woman who makes impossible timelines look easy." She smiled. "That's one way to describe me." They talked numbers, deadlines, logistics, typical workplace language, but somewhere between spreadsheets and budgets. Conversation drifted to lighter ground. Lucas mentioned his weekend trips to art galleries, his fascination with abstract expressionism, his failed attempt at pottery. Claire found herself laughing, genuinely, when he asked, "Have dinner with me sometime. There's a small place downtown with live jazz and a painting exhibition this Friday." She hesitated, but only briefly. "Yes," she said. "That sounds nice." And it did. Friday arrived draped in soft rain, as it often did in Seattle. Claire wore a simple black dress, modest yet graceful, the kind that made her feel quietly confident. Lucas was waiting outside the restaurant, holding an umbrella. "You look stunning," he said, and she thanked him with a shy smile. Dinner was easy, effortless. Even, they talked about travel, about the strange beauty of solitude, about how art had a way of saying what people couldn't. Lucas listened with genuine interest, his laughter warm, his eyes kind. Claire found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. When they left the restaurant, the city lights shimmered across the wet pavement. Lucas suggested coffee, and they ended up at a small cafe tucked between two bookstores, a place with worn leather seats and the smell of cinnamon in the air. Inside, their conversation deepened. Lucas spoke about his parents' old cabin near Lake Chelan, how he spent summers sketching the water, convinced he'd become an artist someday. Life had other plans, he said, smiling softly. Numbers are easier to explain than feelings. Claire nodded, understanding more than she meant to show. Feelings rarely stay within budget. They both laughed, outside, across the street. The reflection of the cafe window blurred in the drizzle, and behind that glass, unseen by her, Ethan Cole stood beneath the edge of a street lamp, rain soaking the shoulders of his coat. He hadn't meant to see her. He'd been heading to a late dinner meeting when, through the corner of his eye, he caught sight of her silhouette framed by the cafe's golden light. And there she was, laughing, with another man. He stopped walking. The sight struck him harder than he expected. Not jealousy exactly, something deeper, quieter, but no less painful. It was the realization of distance, of watching something you'd once touched drift beyond reach. From where he stood, he could see Lucas lean slightly forward, could see the warmth in Claire's smile. She looked different, like this unguarded, light, alive. Inside his chest, something twisted. He remembered her words from that night. "You built that rule to protect yourself, didn't you?" And she had been right. He had built it, brick by brick, layer by layer. And now, standing there in the rain, he understood what it had cost him. "You built a fortress," he thought bitterly, "and now you're the prisoner inside it." He turned away before she could see him. Back in his apartment that night, the city stretched before him like a map of lights distant, untouchable, beautiful. He poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in silence. The glass felt heavy in his hand, the weight of memory heavier still. He thought about the way her eyes had softened that night in the office, the way she had said, "People heal." He wanted to believe her, but healing, he knew, was not the same as forgetting. And forgetting her felt impossible. across the city. Claire returned home to her small apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. She set her heels by the door, exhaled, and smiled faintly. The evening had been pleasant, the conversation genuine. Lucas was kind, interesting, and uncomplicated, everything her heart should have wanted. And yet, as she stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on the water, she felt something missing, a quiet space that no amount of laughter could fill. Somewhere out there, she imagined Ethan standing by his own window, looking out at the same night sky. And though she couldn't see him, she felt the echo of his presence the way two distant waves sometimes rise and fall in rhythm without ever touching. Claire didn't know what the future held, but one truth had begun to take root inside her. You can't run from what you're meant to face. And for Ethan, for herself, she suspected that truth would come calling soon enough. For now. The rain kept falling soft, steady, and full of unspoken things. For days after that evening at the cafe, an invisible shift settled between them, one neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both could feel. The air in the office seemed thicker, charged with something unsaid. Claire noticed it in the way Ethan avoided her eyes during meetings, in how his usual calmness carried a sharp edge of restlessness. She tried to keep her focus on work. Lucas had become a kind presence in her days, someone who made her laugh, who noticed when she skipped lunch, who reminded her that life existed beyond company walls. Their conversations were easy, light, filled with stories about art, music, and travel. There was nothing serious between them, but perhaps that was what made it feel safe. Still, whenever she passed Ethan in the hallway, her heart betrayed her. It quickened, remembering a truth she tried to bury, no matter how hard she tried to move on. Her heart had already chosen its direction. By Wednesday morning, the tension had become impossible to ignore. An email from the executive assistant appeared in her inbox. Meeting request, 2:30 p.m., CEO's office. No subject line, no details, just that. When she arrived, the blinds were half drawn, soft gray light filtering through. Ethan stood by the window, back turned, shoulders rigid beneath his tailored suit. "Close the door," he said, without looking at her. She obeyed, the quiet click of the door echoing louder than it should have. "Sit down," he added. Claire remained standing. "Is something wrong?" He turned then, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes, carried something raw beneath the surface. "I think that's a question I should be asking you." She frowned. "Excuse me?" He walked around his desk, stopping just a few feet from her. "I saw you last Friday, with Lucas Hayes." For a moment, she didn't answer. The words landed like a gust of cold wind. "You saw me?" "Yes." His tone was clipped, restrained. At the cafe near Fifth Avenue, a silent stretch between them, tense and fragile. Claire's heartbeat quickened. "Were you following me?" "Of course not," he said sharply. Then, softer. "It was a coincidence." She let out a slow breath. "And this meeting, what is it? Exactly a coincidence?" "Two." His jaw tightened. "I just want to make sure everything between you and Mr. Hayes stays professional. You're leading a major project. You know the company policy." There it was, the shield of rules, the armor of professionalism. He was retreating behind them again, just as she had feared he would. Claire crossed her arms, her voice steady but cold. "You're worried about policy now, or about something else." Ethan's eyes met hers, sharp and conflicted. "Don't make this personal." She stepped closer. "It already is personal." He turned away, pacing once, then facing her again. "You think this is easy for me? Watching one of my employees, someone under my supervision, getting involved with a consultant. You're putting yourself at risk." "Claire." Her temper flared. "At risk of what? Living my life, feeling something real." His voice rose before he could stop it. "At risk of losing everything you've worked for." She didn't flinch. "You can't control what you're afraid to feel." The words hit him like a strike. For a long moment, he said nothing. The rain outside began to fall harder, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat neither of them could silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, unsteady. "You don't understand. Claire, I can't." He broke off, searching for words, for control, for something to hold on to. Can't what she pressed, her eyes never leaving his. He took a step toward her. "I can't stand the thought of you with anyone else." The confession came out rough, raw, like something torn from him. The silence that followed was electric. Claire's breath caught, then why she began, her voice trembling. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, his face inches from hers. "Because if I don't, I'll break every rule I built to keep people safe, to keep you safe." She could feel the heat of his breath, the tension in the air so thick it hurt to breathe. The world outside seemed to fall away, the office, the rain, the walls, all of it fading into the gravity of that single, suspended moment. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to tell him that she didn't care about the rules, that she would rather lose everything than live half alive, but the words refused to come. He reached out, almost unconsciously, his hand hovering near her face just an inch away. His fingers trembled, caught between desire and restraint. For one impossible second, she thought he would close the distance, but then, with visible effort, he stopped. His hand fell to his side. They stood there in silence, the air thick with everything they couldn't say. Finally, he turned away, his voice hoarse. "You should go." She didn't move. "Ethan, please," he said, not as a command, but as a plea. Claire took a slow step back, her throat tight. "You can keep pretending, if that helps you sleep at night, but it won't stop the truth from being real." He didn't turn. She reached the door, her hand resting on the handle. For a moment, she hesitated, hoping maybe he would say something, anything, but the only sound was the rain. As she walked down the hallway, her heart felt both heavier and lighter. He had finally said it, what she had always known but never heard, and even though it changed nothing, it meant everything. Back inside the office, Ethan sank into his chair, pressing his palms against his temples. Outside the window, the city lights blurred through the rain, shimmering like ghosts of choices he could never take back. He whispered to himself, so quietly it was almost a prayer. "You built a fortress, and now you're the prisoner inside it, and somewhere in another corner of the city." Claire sat in her car, staring out into the night, whispering a truth of her own. Some walls aren't meant to protect. They're meant to be climbed. The rain kept falling, soft and relentless, as if the sky itself couldn't decide whether to weep or to cleanse. The week after their confrontation unfolded like a gray Seattle morning, quiet, heavy, and full of things that refused to clear. Claire avoided him as best she could. She poured her focus into the evergreen project, letting deadlines and details fill the empty spaces where his voice used to echo. Ethan, for his part, buried himself in meetings and board reports, his days running on autopilot. But even the sharpest schedule couldn't hide the ache that followed him like a shadow. Every night, when the building emptied and the city lights flickered across his office window, he'd catch himself thinking of her, of that look in her eyes when she said, "You can't control what you're afraid to feel." It wasn't accusation. It was truth. And that truth had begun to unsettle the walls he had spent years fortifying. It was on one of those late nights that George Miller found him. George was 62, the building's senior maintenance supervisor, and one of the few people in the company who treated Ethan like a man rather than a title. He'd worked there longer than most of the executives had been alive. His hair had gone white, his hands calloused, his voice slow and steady like someone who'd learned to measure life not by speed, but by substance. Ethan was standing alone in the corridor, staring out through the glass at the drizzle that coated the city. The hour was late. The only sounds were the hum of the elevators and the faint echo of cleaning carts down the hall. "You're still here?" George said as he walked by, holding a small toolbox. "Figures?" Ethan turned slightly, offering a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep. George set down his tools, wiping his hands on a rag. You look like a man who's been trying not to feel something. Ethan chuckled softly. That obvious sun, George said, leaning on the handle of his mop. You've got the same look I used to have before I lost my wife. You can call it tired, or busy, or whatever you want. But I know what it really is. Ethan didn't answer. George studied him for a moment, then spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. You remind me of myself before I lost her, always choosing rules over love until there's no one left to love you back. The words landed with the quiet force of truth. Ethan turned toward him. It's not that simple. It never is, George said. But it's that clear. He picked up a wrench, turning it in his hand like a man turning a memory. When my wife, Ellen, got sick, I kept working, told myself I was doing it for us. Bills, stability, pride, responsibility. But truth is, I was scared to sit still long enough to feel how much she was slipping away. Scared to let go of control. He paused, his voice thickening. The night before she passed, she told me, "You don't have to fix everything, George. You just have to be here." He looked up at Ethan, eyes steady. I wasn't, and I've been trying to make peace with that ever since. Ethan swallowed hard. You can't undo the past. No, George said quietly, but you can stop repeating it. Silence stretched between them. The rain tapped gently against the windows, a patient rhythm that seemed to echo the old man's words. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. You ever build something so strong to protect yourself that you end up trapped inside it? George gave a soft, knowing smile. Every man does. The trick is realizing the door's been unlocked the whole time. Ethan exhaled, looking away. You think it's weakness feeling this way? I think it's human, George said. And if you spend your life trying to be anything else, you'll die lonely and proud. Take it from someone who knows. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any advice Ethan had ever heard. For years, he had prided himself on control, on being the man who could manage chaos, contain emotion, keep everything orderly. He had believed it made him strong. But as George's words echoed in the quiet corridor, Ethan realized control hadn't saved him. It had just kept him alone. He thought of Claire, the way she had challenged him, her courage in naming what he wouldn't admit, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, even when she was angry. She had seen through his walls without trying to climb them, and, somehow, that had terrified him more than anything else. George began packing up his tools. Whatever you're fighting, son, make sure it's worth the cost. Rules can build an empire, but they can't warm your bed at night. Ethan smiled faintly. The first real smile in days. You should have gone into management. George laughed softly. Nah, management's too busy pretending they've got it all figured out. He slung the rag over his shoulder and started down the hall, then paused. The lights don't need to be on all night. Mr. Cole, some things get clearer in the dark. Ethan watched him go, the sound of footsteps fading into the quiet. When he returned to his office, the city looked different, still cloaked in mist, but softer somehow, less distant. He sat at his desk, but instead of reaching for another report, he leaned back in his chair and let the silence settle. George's words played over in his mind like a refrain. You remind me of myself before I lost her. Always choosing rules over love. For the first time. Ethan let the weight of that truth sink in. He realized that all this time, he had mistaken fear for discipline, guilt for duty, and isolation for strength. He looked around the office, the glass walls, the polished floors, the pristine order of everything, and felt, for a fleeting moment, how hollow it all was without someone to share it with. Outside, the rain began to ease. The moon peeked through a break in the clouds, its pale light glimmering off the glass. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered, almost to himself, maybe it's time to stop guarding the ruins. And somewhere, beneath the armor he had worn for years, Something small but undeniable began to stir a seed of change, fragile but alive. It was the beginning of a thaw. After his late-night conversation with George Miller, something in Ethan began to shift. It wasn't a loud revelation, but a quiet awakening, like frost melting under the first light of spring. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a world where rules didn't have to guard every feeling, but change, as life often reminded him, never arrived without consequence. 2 weeks later, whispers began to spread through the glass corridors of Northern Peaks. They moved softly at first, the way rumors always do, disguised as harmless curiosity, passed over morning coffee or in the elevator between floors. Have you noticed how often she meets with him? They say she's the reason he stays late. No one climbs that fast without someone helping them. By the end of the week, the company had a new story. The CEO and the operations manager. Claire heard it first in the break room, 2 junior analysts murmuring near the window. When they saw her, their voices dropped, and they turned away too quickly. It wasn't what they said that hurt her. It was the silence that followed. That knowing, poisoned quiet. She left her coffee untouched and returned to her office, her chest tight. Across the building, Ethan heard the same whispers from a board member who thought he should be aware of the perception issue. The tone had been polite, but the meaning wasn't lost on him. By Monday, the board of directors had called for a private meeting. The chairman, a man with silver hair and colder eyes, spoke plainly. There are rumors circulating. Ethan, about you and Ms. Donovan. Normally, we'd dismiss them, but given the zero relationship policy, you can understand the sensitivity. Ethan said nothing, his face expressionless. The chairman continued, "We'll need you to handle this internally. Verify the facts. If there's truth to the claims, we'll have no choice but to terminate both parties involved." The words fell like iron. Terminate both parties. Ethan nodded once, controlled as ever, understood. But as he walked back to his office, the echo of those words followed him. He had written that policy himself to prevent chaos, to protect the company, to protect himself. And now, it was aimed squarely at the woman who had taught him how hollow protection could be. That evening, long after most of the building had emptied, Ethan found Claire still at her desk, the glow of her computer reflecting in her tired eyes. He stood in the doorway for a moment before knocking softly. She looked up. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city hummed faintly outside, rain tapping against the glass. "They called me in," he said finally. "The board. There are rumors." She didn't flinch. "I've heard them too. They want me to investigate," he continued, voice low. "If there's any truth to it, they'll fire us." She finished for him. He nodded. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "You really built yourself a perfect trap, didn't you, Claire?" "No, don't," she interrupted softly. "You don't have to explain. I knew the rules when I came here. I just didn't know how much they'd cost." Her voice wavered, not from anger, but from something far more fragile. "I can't be the reason your world falls apart. Ethan, maybe it's better if I resign before it gets worse." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Don't do that. I don't see another way," she said, standing. "You're fighting for your company. And she paused, her eyes meeting his. "I'm fighting for my heart." The silence between them deepened, heavy with the truth neither wanted to face. Ethan moved closer, the control in his voice beginning to crack. "And I'm losing both." Her eyes softened, the ache in his words cutting through every wall she'd tried to build. "You don't have to," she whispered. "Yes," he said, almost pleading. "I do. I have to protect what I built." She shook her head gently. "You built a company. Ethan, not a life." He stared at her, words failing him. The rain outside grew louder, a steady, unrelenting rhythm. She stepped closer. "You can't keep saving everything except yourself." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he could fix this, that he could control the narrative, protect them both. But deep down, he knew she was right. He had built an empire of glass, strong, beautiful, transparent. But one touch of truth, and it would shatter. When she turned to leave, he caught her wrist gently, desperately. Claire. Her breath caught for a heartbeat. They stood inches apart, the world narrowing to the space between them. His hand trembled where it touched her skin, every muscle in his body warring between desire and restraint. "Tell me what to do," he said quietly. "Tell me how to fix this." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes full of sorrow and something deeper love that had nowhere safe to land. "You can't fix what you're afraid to feel," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, gentle but final. She pulled her hand free and walked out, leaving him alone in the dim light of his office. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at the door that had closed behind her. The sound of the rain blended with the faint hum of the city below, and he realized that, for all his power, he had never felt so powerless. Outside, the world went on, lights flickering across wet streets, traffic moving steadily through the mist. But inside that glass tower, something had cracked open in both of them. For Claire, it was the realization that love shouldn't have to fight for permission. For Ethan, it was the understanding that control, no matter how noble its disguise, was still fear wearing a tie. And as the night deepened, both of them stood on opposite sides of the same truth sometimes. The heart has to break before it learns how to be free. That night, the rain returned to Seattle, the kind of rain that blurred the line between sky and street, soft yet relentless, whispering through every alley and window pane. In her apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, Claire sat alone by the window, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. She hadn't heard from Ethan since their last conversation. She didn't expect to. The words they'd exchanged still echoed in her chest. "You're fighting for a company." "Ethan, I'm fighting for my heart." And his broken reply, "And I'm losing both." She told herself that was the end of it, that she'd done the right thing by walking away before their story turned into a scandal neither of them could survive. But doing the right thing, she realized, didn't always feel right. Sometimes it just felt empty. The rain deepened, tapping softly against the glass. In the reflection of the window, she caught her own eyes, tired, wistful, but alive. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself cry. Not out of regret, but out of the quiet grief of loving someone you couldn't have. Across the city, Ethan sat in his office, the lights dim, the air thick with unspoken truths. The board had called another meeting that morning, pressing for answers he couldn't bring himself to give. Every instinct in him screamed to protect her, to protect the company. But the man he had become was at war with the man he had always been. He had built his life on control, on certainty, on never letting emotions dictate decisions. But love had a way of undoing even the most disciplined of men. As the night stretched past midnight, he found himself staring out at the storm, thinking of her, her laughter, her stubborn courage, the way her voice softened when she said his name. And suddenly, staying away felt harder than breaking every rule he'd ever written. He grabbed his coat and left. By the time he reached her building, the rain was pouring harder, soaking through his clothes. The elevator was slow, the kind that creaked and hummed as though reluctant to carry confessions to the floor where they belonged. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, followed by something she tried to hide: hope. "Ethan," her voice was soft, almost disbelieving. He stood there, drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat dripping onto the floor. He looked like a man who had walked through every storm inside and out. "I shouldn't be here," he said, breath uneven. "Then why are you?" He took a step forward, his voice trembling but certain. "Because I can't not be." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain filled the silence between them, steady and relentless. Then he said quietly, "You were right, you know, about everything." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, eyes dark with exhaustion and truth. "About fear, about control, about hiding behind rules. I've spent my whole life building walls to keep pain out, and all I've done is keep love from getting in. Ethan? No. Please, he said, his voice breaking just enough to sound human again. Let me say this before I lose my nerve. He took another step closer, his words slow, deliberate, each one heavy with memory. 7 years ago, I fell in love with someone I worked with. It ended badly. I lost her. I lost the company. And I told myself I'd never let my heart interfere with my duty again. So, I made that policy. Not to protect anyone else, but to protect me. From ever feeling this much again, Claire's eyes softened. And now he gave a small, pained smile. Now I realized the policy didn't save me. It just made me smaller. And then you walked in with that quiet strength, that impossible kindness, and I started to remember what it felt like to be alive again. She took a slow breath, her heart aching with every word. Why are you telling me this? Because I can't ask you to stay, he said. Not while I'm the man who made the rules that hurt you. But I also can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you isn't real. The air between them pulsed with everything they'd been holding back. Claire took a step closer, the soft light of the apartment catching the glint of tears in her eyes. You don't have to protect me. Ethan. I know, he whispered, but I do have to love you. And then, for the first time, he reached for her not in hesitation, not in guilt, but in surrender. His hands framed her face, his touch trembling as if afraid she might disappear. The kiss was quiet, deep, and certain, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like the moment two broken pieces finally found where they belonged. The world outside seemed to hush for it. The rain softened, the thunder faded, and even time itself seemed to pause, watching. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence carried everything: grief, forgiveness, and something that felt dangerously close to peace. Ethan's voice came out low, rough around the edges. If loving you means breaking every rule, he said, then I'll rewrite them all. Claire closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, but her smile was real. Then start with this one, she whispered. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle. The city glowed through the mist, soft, forgiving, alive. Ethan stayed for a while, sitting with her by the window as the world settled into stillness. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to. In that small, quiet apartment, between the hum of the rain and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to beat again, the rules didn't matter. All that mattered was that, for once, neither of them was afraid to feel. And in the tender stillness of that night, something sacred began, not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a truth. The morning after the storm always feels quieter than it should. The world seems to pause, as if reluctant to move forward, afraid of what might come next. When Claire woke, the rain had stopped. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and salt air drifting through the half-open window. Ethan was gone, but his absence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a man who had left to face the truth he'd been running from. On the table, she found a note written in his clean, steady handwriting. I won't let you carry this alone. E. She read it twice, then pressed it to her chest, feeling the weight of both love and dread settle in equal measure. Across the city, in the high glass tower of Northern Peaks, the boardroom was already filling. The early light filtered through wide windows, painting cold reflections on the polished floor. Ethan stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his suit still damp at the cuffs, his expression composed but grave. Around him, the members of the board of directors murmured among themselves. The air was heavy with expectation and judgment. The chairman cleared his throat. Mr. Cole, before we begin, I'll remind you this is a formal hearing. Allegations have surfaced suggesting you have engaged in a personal relationship with an employee under your supervision. Ethan met his gaze calmly. They aren't allegations, he said. "They're the truth." The room fell silent. One of the senior members leaned forward. "You're admitting it, I am," Ethan said. "I am in love with Claire Donovan, and I will not hide it." The words landed like thunder. For a moment, no one breathed. A woman from the legal department whispered something sharp to the chairman. Another director frowned, murmuring about reputation risks and policy breaches. But Ethan stood still, his voice steady. "I wrote the policy," he continued, "and I'm rewriting it now. I will take full responsibility for the consequences." The chairman's tone hardened. "You understand this will cause significant fallout. The press could get wind of this. The shareholders won't like the message it sends." "I understand," Ethan said simply. "But I also understand what hypocrisy looks like. We claim to build a company that values integrity and humanity. It's time we live by that." For the first time in years, he spoke without fear, not as a CEO defending a position, but as a man reclaiming his truth. Across the city, Claire sat at her desk, unaware of the scene unfolding above her. She'd arrived early, her heart heavy with unease. Something in her told her this calm wouldn't last. By mid-morning, whispers began again, only louder this time, charged with disbelief. By noon, her email pinged with the news she had dreaded. Someone had leaked the story. The subject line was short, brutal. "Cole admits affair policy under fire." Her stomach turned. She opened the article. There it was. His name, her name, the company's name, all twisted into a story meant for headlines, not hearts. Outside her office, the phones rang non-stop. She could hear the low hum of conversations, the sharp edge of gossip. By the time Ethan called, her decision was already forming like a knot in her chest. When she entered his office, he was standing by the window again, looking out over the rain-washed city. "They know," she said quietly. "I know." She moved closer, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have done that. You didn't have to take the blame." He turned toward her, his expression soft but resolute. "Yes, I did. Ethan, your career, your reputation, are not worth more than honesty," he said. "I've spent years running from what I felt, hiding behind rules and policies that made me smaller. I won't keep doing it, not at your expense." Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head. "And what about me? Every headline has my name next to yours. Every whisper, every stare. I can't breathe in that office anymore." He took a step closer, but she stepped back. "Claire, no," she said firmly, her voice trembling. "You're fighting for a company. Ethan, I'm fighting for my heart." His chest tightened. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment, she saw all the weight he carried, the guilt, the love, the impossible balance between who he was and who he wanted to be. "And I'm losing both," he said softly. The room fell quiet, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Claire closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "Then maybe the only way to save what's left is for one of us to walk away." He stared at her, words caught in his throat. She smiled through her tears. "A sad, beautiful thing. You've already given enough. Let me be the one who leaves this time." She turned toward the door, pausing only once. "You once said people build walls to protect themselves, but sometimes those walls protect something worth breaking for." And then she was gone. Ethan didn't stop her. He couldn't. He stood in the silence she left behind, the echo of her footsteps fading like rain drying on glass. Outside, the city pulsed with noise reporters, whispers, headlines, but in that office high above the streets, all he could hear was the quiet truth of what love had cost and what it had set free. For Claire, it was the pain of leaving something unfinished, yet knowing it mattered. For Ethan, it was the beginning of something far greater than redemption courage, because sometimes the consequence of love isn't ruin, it's transformation. And as the storm outside cleared, sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the skyline like forgiveness. The morning after the headlines, the city woke to a different kind of weather, one that didn't come from the sky. It was the hum of opinion, the rush of speculation, the quickening of breath in hallways where people spoke too softly and stared too long. For Northern Peaks, the forecast wasn't rain or sun, it was scrutiny. Ethan read the stories before dawn, standing in his kitchen with the lights off, the glow of his phone casting pale lines across his face. Some articles were measured, others were cruel. None of them knew what had really happened between two people who had tried to be better than their fears and failed their rules instead. He set the phone down and watched the city gather itself in the muted light. By 8:00, he had called a press conference, not a memo, not a carefully worded internal statement, a room with cameras, and his voice, and the choice to say exactly what he meant. On the 12th floor, Claire arrived early and stood at the far end of the corridor, holding a folder she didn't need. She knew what he was about to do. She could feel it in the building itself, in the way the air seemed tighter, almost braced. Martha passed her and squeezed her hand once, a quiet gesture that said everything a speech couldn't. When the conference room doors opened, reporters filled the rows, voices, wires, the click of lenses like hail on glass. The board gathered in a line off to the side, guarded faces composed for public view. Ethan stepped to the podium with no notes. The microphone caught a faint breath before words came. "I won't start with policy," he said evenly. "I'll start with truth." Room noise softened. We built Northern Peaks to honor moments' birthdays, homecomings, long-awaited reunions. We ask our guests to bring their humanity through our doors. We ask our teams to serve them with empathy. But somewhere along the way, I asked my employees to leave a part of their humanity at the threshold. He paused. I wrote a policy that called love a risk, and I enforced it as if love were a liability. A reporter started to speak. He lifted a hand gently, not to silence, but to hold the room steady. "Love isn't a liability," he said, his voice firm now. "It's what makes us human." The words settled with weight, not as a slogan, but as a confession. He went on, slowly, clearly. Mature adults can navigate feelings and responsibility. We can disclose relationships. We can recuse ourselves from decisions that compromise fairness. We can put structures in place that protect both people and the work they care about. We can do all of this without criminalizing what is human. He looked toward the board table, then back to the cameras. "I am proposing that we replace the zero relationship policy with something more honest, an ethical relationship standard, transparent disclosure, professional boundaries, no direct reporting lines, accountability for power imbalances, training in emotional maturity, not fear." A murmur moved through the room, not hostile, just startled by the simplicity of it. "And yes," he said, steady as a metronome, "I am in love with Claire Donovan. I told our board that yesterday. I'm telling you today. I will not hide it. I will abide by whatever standard we adopt. I will step back from any oversight of her work. And if this costs me my position, I accept that cost." Questions erupted like rain on a tin roof. He answered patiently. One by one, no defensiveness, no spin, just a man who had learned the subtle mercy of speaking plainly. Up on the mezzanine, watching through glass, Claire felt something inside her loosen. It wasn't relief yet. It was the first breath after holding too much for too long. She didn't know if she wanted to cry, or to run to him, or to run from the fallout gathering like storm clouds behind those cameras. She only knew that, whatever happened next, he had chosen honesty, and that changed the shape of everything. The board met that afternoon. The hours moved slowly, like inches measured across a mile. In the first 20 minutes, the old fears arrived in familiar suits, liability, headlines, shareholder trust. In the next 20, something else entered the room, a conversation that wasn't armored by fear. Directors spoke about retention and culture, about how distrust corrodes teams, about how grown-ups don't need to be policed to be professional. Martha reminded them what people are capable of when they're treated as people. A younger director told a quiet story about her parents meeting in a hotel kitchen 35 years ago. Still married, still working, still kind. In the end, it wasn't a romantic argument that carried the day. It was a practical one. Truth travels farther than rumor, and dignity scales better than fear. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The zero relationship policy would be retired. The ethical relationship standard would take its place clear, enforceable, human. When Ethan stepped out into the corridor, Claire was there, her back to the wall, hands folded around nothing at all. He didn't speak, neither did she. They just looked at each other like people who had walked through fire and still smelled smoke. "It passed," he said. She nodded, a slow breath leaving her. "I heard." There was a pause, then another truth to deliver. He held her gaze. "I've tendered my resignation." The floor seemed to tilt a few degrees. "You what?" "It's the right boundary," he said, quiet, unflinching. "Not because we've done something wrong, but because I wrote the old rule and enforced it. The company needs to see this change isn't self-serving. Northern Peak should stand without my shadow on this moment. You should stand without it." She stepped closer, eyes searching his. "You don't have to fix the world by leaving it." "This isn't leaving the world," he said, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "It's leaving a job." Claire shook her head, tears shining now. "You built this place, not alone, but you did. And you don't get to make me the reason you walk away from it." He reached for her hand, not to persuade, just to hold. "I'm not walking away because of you. I'm walking toward the man I want to be, the one who tells the truth and lives with the cost." She stood there, the elevator's soft chime echoing down the hall, the afternoon light bending across the carpet in long, patient lines. Then she said the only words that could meet his and measure up. "We built this together. We face it together." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the sentence itself were a balm. "If we face it together, then we do it cleanly. No special treatment, no shortcuts. I'll recuse from everything that touches your work until my transition is complete. You will keep leading Evergreen because you're the best person for it, not because you're with me." She squeezed his hand, a quiet affirmation. "Then we'll do it that way." In the days that followed, the company adjusted to its new compass. HR drafted the ethical relationship standard with clarity and grace. Leadership training swapped fear for responsibility. Teams talked about boundaries the way they talked about budget lines, straightforward, necessary, not shameful. The press found fewer sparks to fan when transparency left little oxygen for scandal. And something else shifted. Subtler, but real people began to relax into their work. Laughter returned to break rooms. A pastry chef at a mountain lodge sent a wedding invitation to the corporate office with a note that said, "Thanks for believing two people can love and still do their jobs." On Ethan's last afternoon, the staff gathered in a modest space on the 10th floor. No grand speeches, no heroic fanfare, just a few words, a few smiles, a few grateful tears. George Miller stood in the back, arms folded, nodding once when Ethan caught his eye as if to say, "You chose the living thing." Afterward, he and Claire walked the long corridor together, the way you walk a familiar trail one more time to tell your feet goodbye. At the glass, they paused to watch the sound, a ribbon of pewter under a pale sky. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He considered, then shook his head. "No, regret belongs to a life unlived." This he looked at her, steady and unafraid. "This feels like the start of the honest one." Down below, the streets glimmered from an earlier mist, each puddle reflecting a patient slice of light. People moved in patterns you could only see from above, small and determined, carrying their own quiet battles. Ethan slipped his hand into hers. No hiding, no rush, just enough pressure to say, "Here I am." Change doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It shows up like this, a policy rewritten, a room that breathes easier, two people choosing the braver sentence when a safer one would do. And as they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, the future did what it always does. It opened one careful inch at a time, leaving just enough space for hope to step through. A year can change everything, or it can simply bring clarity to what the heart has known all along. 12 months had passed since Ethan stepped down from Northern Peaks, since the day he chose truth over title. The story that had once been scandal had softened into something quieter, almost noble. The company moved forward stronger, kinder, more human, and so did he. Claire remained for a time, helping to steady the team and guide the transition. When the dust settled, she followed her own calling, consulting for new hospitality ventures that sought meaning, not just profit. Ethan joined her months later, not as her boss, not even as her savior, but as her equal. Together, they built something small yet profound. Open Horizon, consulting a firm that designed spaces for connection, not control. Their lives no longer revolved around deadlines and policies, but around people, around the belief that kindness was still the most valuable currency in business. And yet, even with purpose and peace filling their days, there remained one place neither of them had returned to, a place that had started everything. Carmel by the sea. It was a mild September evening when they drove the coastal road back toward that familiar stretch of Pacific air. The car windows were cracked open, the sound of the waves tumbling in like an old song. The smell of salt and pine carried memories of a night lit by moonlight and uncertainty, when two strangers had met without knowing they'd found the rest of their story. The Lighthouse Grill. Claire said softly as the sign came into view, still weathered, still glowing faintly against the twilight. Ethan smiled. It hasn't changed. Neither has the ocean, she replied. It just keeps coming back. They parked along the narrow street and walked toward the restaurant. Inside, the same wooden beams stretched across the ceiling. The same flicker of candlelight touched the faces of couples who sat close, whispering over glasses of wine. The air carried that familiar hum of waves outside, steady, patient, eternal. A hostess recognized them from years ago. "You're the couple who stayed till closing that night," she said with a knowing grin. "We still tell that story sometimes." Claire laughed, cheeks warming. "We weren't even a couple then." The woman smiled. Some things take time. They were seated near the same spot on the balcony, where the ocean stretched out before them like an open memory. The sun was sinking low, spilling orange and gold across the water, and the first faint shimmer of moonlight began to edge the horizon. A bottle of white wine arrived, the same kind they'd shared that night long ago. Ethan poured 2 glasses, his movements unhurried, reverent. "To beginnings," he said softly, raising his glass. Claire tilted hers to meet it, and to everything that had to end first. They drank quietly, the sound of the waves rising and falling beneath them. For a long while, they simply sat in the comfort of knowing no words needed, no questions left unanswered. Ethan leaned back, watching the moon climb higher. "Do you ever think about that night?" Claire smiled faintly. "I think about it every time I smell sea air. I remember how strange it felt to be free and lost at the same time." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I think I knew, even then. There was something about you, the way you looked out at the ocean, like you were listening for something only you could hear." She turned to him, eyes soft. "And did you ever find what you were listening for?" He met her gaze and said quietly, "I'm looking at it." The words settled between them, not dramatic, not rushed, just true. A breeze moved through, lifting strands of her hair. She tucked them behind her ear, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the space between their breaths. Time folded, bringing the woman who once sat here in heartbreak, face to face with the woman she had become, whole, certain, unafraid. They talked for hours, remembering what it took to get here, the board meetings, the sleepless nights, the leaving and the coming back, the mistakes that turned into lessons, the love that survived all of it, not untouched, but tested and made real. When the plates were cleared and the last of the wine gone, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. For a moment, he just held the small velvet box in his palm, feeling the weight of it, not just the metal and stone, but everything it meant. He turned toward her, his voice low, steady as the tide. "Claire," he said, "a year ago, we stood in the ruins of the life I built on fear. You helped me rebuild it with truth. You've seen the worst of me, and somehow you've loved me anyway. I don't want another day to pass pretending this love is temporary. Not this time. He opened the box. Inside, the ring caught the candlelight simple, elegant, a single diamond set in gold, glowing like moonlight captured in glass. Will you marry me? For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The sound of the waves filled the space where her answer was meant to be. Then she smiled, a slow, radiant smile that reached her eyes. The same smile she'd worn the night he first saw her by this very sea. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. She leaned forward, and when their lips met, it felt less like a promise and more like coming home. Somewhere inside the restaurant, a soft melody began to play, something classical, gentle, full of old warmth, the kind of song that doesn't need to be remembered to be felt. They sat together long after the music faded, watching the moon climb fully into the sky. The ocean shimmered beneath it, infinite and forgiving, whispering the same song it always had. Around them, the world went on, cars passing, glasses clinking, laughter rising from other tables, but for them, everything was still. Ethan took her hand. Do you realize, he said quietly, we've come full circle. She squeezed his fingers. No, she said with a small smile. We've come forward. The waves rolled in again, soft and endless, and somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse light swept slowly across the dark water, steady, constant, returning again and again to the same horizon. And as the night deepened, two people who had once met as strangers by the sea now sat beneath the same sky, no longer searching, no longer hiding, just loving, simply, completely. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories don't end where they began, they end where we finally learn to stay. 2 years passed quietly, steadily, like the tide returning to shore. The world had changed in small but meaningful ways. New projects came, old storms faded, and the love that once lived in secret now moved through the open air of ordinary days. Ethan and Claire had learned that real happiness doesn't arrive with fanfare, it settles into the spaces between moments, into the way two people share a morning coffee, into the quiet trust of building something together. Their company, Open Horizon Hospitality, began in a one-room office overlooking the harbor in Seattle. It started with an idea that the best businesses aren't built on fear, but on connection. They specialized in creating hotel cultures where people felt seen, valued, and human. From the beginning, Ethan refused to replicate the corporate systems he'd once believed in. On the first page of their employee handbook, printed in clean, simple text, was the line that defined everything they stood for. People fall in love, and that's not a problem to solve, it's a story to celebrate. It wasn't a marketing slogan, it was a truth they had earned, and in an industry known for its polished veneers, their honesty became their signature. In the first year, Open Horizon helped transform 3 small family-owned hotels that had been struggling after the pandemic. Instead of standardizing them into efficiency, Claire taught owners how to bring emotion back into their spaces through design, scent, sound, and kindness. Guests began leaving not just reviews, but letters, stories of being remembered by name, of staff who listened, of feeling cared for in a world that often felt rushed. Ethan handled strategy and structure. Claire handled people and purpose. Together, they found a rhythm that felt less like work and more like harmony. There were challenges, of course. There always are when ideals meet the reality of business. But every time one of them faltered, the other steadied the balance. It was never perfect, but it was honest, and that, they discovered, was enough. By the end of their second year, Open Horizon Hospitality had grown to a team of 37. That spring, they hosted their first company anniversary dinner at a seaside inn in Monterey, not far from where it had all begun. The evening glowed with soft golden light. Tables were lined with candles and fresh eucalyptus. Employees mingled with clients, the air full of laughter and the faint sound of a jazz trio playing in the corner. Among the guests was George Miller, now retired, still carrying his quiet wisdom and a cane he swore he didn't need. He had been invited as their guest of honor. When he arrived, Claire hugged him warmly. "You made it," she said. "Wouldn't miss it," George replied with a grin. "Someone's got to make sure you two are still human after all this success." Later that evening, when the crowd grew calm and the music softened, Ethan raised a glass. "2 years ago," he began, "we decided that business could be both profitable and kind. That structure and soul didn't have to be enemies. Tonight, I want to thank every one of you who believed that and lived it." He paused, his eyes finding George's in the crowd. "And I want to thank the man who once told me something I'll never forget, that rules can build walls, but love builds bridges." There was a quiet ripple of applause, but George only smiled, shaking his head. "I just told you what life taught me the hard way," he said when the room quieted again. "But you two, you proved it. You showed everyone here that love can be both professional and passionate, if it's honest." Ethan and Claire exchanged a look, tender, humble, grateful. When the evening ended, they walked down to the beach together, shoes in hand, the sand cool beneath their feet. The moon hung low over the Pacific, its silver reflection stretching out across the quiet water. It was the same ocean that had carried their first meeting, their first kiss, their first confession, and now it carried their peace. They walked in silence for a while, listening to the slow rhythm of the waves. Claire's dress brushed against the surf, her hair catching the light breeze. Ethan broke the silence first. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think breaking the rules would destroy everything I'd built. Turns out, it just showed me what was worth keeping." Claire smiled. "Maybe that's how it works. You break what was never meant to hold you, and what remains, that's your truth." He looked at her, the corners of his eyes warm with affection. "You still talk like a poet. And you," she said, teasing gently, "still listen like a man who used to run the world, but finally learned to stop running." He laughed quietly, guilty. They reached a driftwood log near the waterline and sat, shoulders touching, watching the tide roll in. The sound of the waves was steady and eternal, like time itself taking a deep, patient breath. Claire looked out at the horizon, the line between sky and sea barely visible under the moonlight. She spoke softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried on the wind. "Sometimes the rule you break," she said, "is the life you begin." Ethan turned toward her, eyes reflecting the silver light. "And sometimes," he said, "you don't realize how much you were waiting to begin until you finally do." They sat like that for a long time, no words, no rush, just two lives that had learned to grow at their own pace. Around them, the world went on the faint call of a seabird, the low hush of waves, the quiet pulse of a universe that had watched countless beginnings before theirs. But in that moment, there was only this: a love that had survived misunderstanding, judgment, and fear, and emerged softer, wiser, truer. And as the tide washed closer, erasing their footprints in the sand, neither felt loss in it, only renewal. Because some stories, like the ocean itself, never really end, they just return, again and again, reshaping the shore. The moon rose higher, the night deepened, and far out on the horizon, a single light blinked from a distant boat, steady, unwavering, like a promise kept. And for a long, quiet while, the world seemed perfectly still, because love, when lived honestly, doesn't just change two people, it rewrites the rules for everyone who learns from their courage. In the end, she never imagined the man who dominated her body would be her boss. Isn't just a love story. It's a reflection on courage, honesty, and second chances. It reminds us that life rarely unfolds according to our plans, and that sometimes losing what we thought we needed is how we find what truly matters. Through Claire and Ethan's journey, we see that love isn't weakness. It's the quiet strength to face ourselves without fear. Rules, titles, and appearances can give us order, but only truth gives us peace. And truth often asks for something difficult, vulnerability. For those of us who have lived long enough to carry both joy and regret, this story is a gentle reminder it's never too late to begin again, to forgive, to open our hearts, to choose connection over caution. Because the rules we once followed may have kept us safe, but they may also have kept us small. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do in this life is to love honestly, even when the world tells us not to. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of your own journey, or simply made you pause and feel, we'd love for you to stay with us. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories about love, resilience, and the quiet courage of being human to life. Every story we tell is a light, and with you here, that light shines a little brighter. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for listening and for believing in the power of stories that heal.